All right, welcome to the Everyday Rabbi, episode 2. We have the guests just becoming more and more interesting. So I'm here with a close friend, old friend, young friend, Joe Davis. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. Well, apparently I should have showed up at the end of the podcast series because then I could have been the most interesting person in the room. But.
Yes, I know. You have to come back. Or I'm sure our next conversation will be more interesting than this conversation.
There you go.
Guaranteed. So welcome. Tell me a little about yourself.
Sure. So my name is Joe, or Yosef Hanan ben Yosel Halevi, and I happen to be Jewish and love being Jewish. And as you know, we've spent many days and nights talking about what it means to be Jewish, having a connection to the Jewish world and what the world looks like in general through a Jewish lens and otherwise. So,
right. And we know each other going back
at least 10 years.
At least 10 years, probably close to 12 even.
Yeah, I got here sometime around 2012, 2013, something like that.
So I remember one of our first conversations we ever had, and the discussion was about God. And if I remember correctly, you know, our recollections of history sometimes are a little fuzzy after 10 years, but you said something to the effect of, I don't know if I believe in God. And I said something to the effect of, do you believe in the Jewish people? And you said, definitely. So let's start from there. Let's talk about the our Jewishness.
So I actually don't remember that conversation.
Does it make sense?
I've questioned everything in my life at some point in my life. And one of the things that I think is really important as a human as well as a Jew is to be open to new information, guiding you in different directions. And so I dealt with a fair amount of antisemitism when I was a kid. That made me...
Where was that?
That was in Buffalo, New York. And so there were ranging from fairly minor things to fairly significant things. And it was not the most comfortable thing to be a Jew. And so as a kid, when something is uncomfortable, what do? You learn to back off from it. And so when I was probably single digits and early teens, there were certain things that I loved about Judaism and being Jewish, and there were other things that caused discomfort, let's say. And then when I was a teenager, I joined BBYO. I'm sure you're familiar with BBYO, and NCSY and several different Jewish youth groups. And it was a wonderful experience because it was the first time in my life that I was with other Jews my age that were proud to be Jewish. My parents were proud to be Jewish. I had a lot of family that was proud to be Jewish. I have family that ranges from secular kibbutzniks to ultra-Orthodox, kippah, payas, etc. So I was exposed to the full spectrum, but I wasn't on a daily basis interacting with Jews my age who had a pride in being Jewish. And these were not, I mean, some of them were more religious, but most of them were not overly religious kids. They were just connected. And for BBYO specifically, they picked me to be the beau. So
explain what that means.
So in BBYO, you have guys events and girls events. And the guys pick one girl who they call the sweetheart to come to all their events and report back, and vice versa.
Like a spy.
Like a spy, yes. A friendly spy. And so that was a great way of getting a teenage boy with hormones to continue coming back to something Jewish. And so I got to go to all the girls' events and then come and report back.
This is how it started.
This is how it started. But
not a lot of debate and disagreements on the girl side, right? Not as much.
I don't remember that part of it.
A lot of emotions, a lot of feelings.
Yeah. But you started this by saying, I don't know if I believe in God. And I think at times in my life, I questioned it. But for me now, where I've settled, at least for the moment and have been for a while, is belief is something that you don't experience. Belief is something that you don't feel. It's something that you think might be there because of indications, but I feel God. And so I don't know if I've evolved since our conversation, or you're thinking of a conversation with someone else, or I've changed multiple times.
The second half, I think, is accurate about the Jewish people. That belief in the Jewish people, or feeling a connection to our people, is something which is, for some Jews, a lot more practical than belief in God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and as a Jew, to be connected to thousands of years of history and everything that the Jews have given the world is unbelievably powerful. I have friends from many different cultures, and I've had the joy of experiencing many different cultures. And when I interact with other Jews, especially Jews who are perhaps less connected to Judaism, and I did that. I worked as a guide for Birthright for many years. And so I interacted with a lot of kids who were perhaps less connected. And I would often hear conversations about, oh, it's so wonderful that fill in the blank group has this deep, rich culture, and I wish we had it. And as my own knowledge of our culture and history and all this value that we bring to the world grew, I sort of made it my mission to share that, because we do, there are all wonderful groups out there that have wonderful aspects. We're not an exception to that. We are very much part of that. And if you look at things like science and technology, how much Jews have contributed to the world, it's such an honor to be part of that.
Isn't it interesting also how throughout I would argue most of that multi-thousand year, multi-millennia eras, epochs, generations, cultural shifts and so on, the Jew, for the most part, was silenced and wasn't allowed a platform, maybe a very small platform in the corner, without a very loud mic. The mic was turned off, or worse, or literally burnt at the stake for saying things that, they believed were true, an opinion, God forbid. How does that, how do you think that that's changed in the last 50 years, 100 years, 20 years?
Well, so in order to innovate, by definition, you have to question what is considered established fact at the time. And I think many societies focus on keeping in line, on not questioning. And in fact, one of my favorite things to do is bring a friend who's not Jewish to an Orthodox shul, because you have people in the congregation saying, no, that's not what it says. Oh, you missed a line, questioning the rabbi and or correcting him. And everybody gets along, and it's not a big deal. And if you go into other houses of worship, that's not necessarily the case. And so I've had friends of mine who are not Jewish come and say, how could that happen? But it's the rabbi. And of course, you treat a rabbi with respect, but respect is different.
Respectfully disagreeing.
Right, exactly. And that's part of Judaism, is debate and questioning. Not only are we taught to question our own history and religion, but we're also taught to question, debate everything. And so I think that one of the reasons that Jews have had the success that they had while being under the thumb of a different group around the world, being silenced, not having the freedom to live their lives the way they wanted to, is they had to innovate. They were forced to. So they had thousands of years of being forced to innovate. And so now in today's world, where Jews have that freedom to innovate, you see that the heads of almost every big tech company or founders are Jews. Facebook, Google, WhatsApp, you can just keep going and keep going. And so now that we are allowed to function in the world as equals to everyone else, it's allowed us to flourish. But there's this term called farming the Jews. I don't know if you've ever heard it. And historically, countries or groups would bring in Jews when they wanted to stimulate their economy. And then once it reached a satisfactory point, they would kick them out.
And then the country would collapse.
And
actually, there's a fascinating statement, almost like it's a fact of life, and you could observe this in history. Both students of history in a very I think history is a fascinating treasure box of so many examples, and those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And unfortunately, it feels like we're repeating a lot of mistakes that people have made. Someone was talking about what's going on in Israel the last 11 months now, and said, "Bro, you're failing an open book test. Like, we know how this goes, we know how it ends. We've seen this over and over throughout history." But I think that one of those examples of history is this concept of constantly seeing the same disagreements, the same sort of problems, inconsistencies with respect to the Jew. So, for example, the Jew is an opportunity. The Jew is, let's bring him into our country, but not too much, opportunity, too much responsibility. And then when they feel that the Jew is sort of lasted his welcome, then the Jew leaves, and the country seems to collapse overnight. I mean, you can think of 16th century Spain. You can think of Russia. I mean, Russia was the superpower of the world. We forget just as recently as a couple decades ago, and communism fell, and the Jews left, and what's Russia today? Russia is a fraction of what it used to be, and definitely not the USSR of then. So there's I think a spiritual component to that. There's also a material component that the Jewish people are dedicated to, contrary to maybe some of the narratives on social media today, is that we want our countries to succeed. We want our world to be a better place. We're trying to innovate, whether it's in the Talmud, whether it's in Jewish law, or it's on the playing field. We want every aspect of our life to be as good as it could be. And we work very hard towards that. And I think that this narrative lately that it's not a new narrative. It's the late narrative that has come up over and over whenever, the Jewish people are criticized is, we're selfish and self-serving and so on. And this idea that we're really here to serve humanity and not just ourselves, which is really an old Jewish idea, or lagoyim, right? To be a light unto the nations. And it's interesting, maybe we could talk about this for a moment, of this idea of being chosen, which is very controversial for no good reason. If you choose to help somebody, if you choose to be a coach, if you choose to be a mentor, if you choose to be a facilitator of something good in the world, why would that be critiqued? That should be admired. So how do we talk about this? What's your inner perspective on this?
Good question. So I just want to go back for one sec to what you said in thinking about why Jews bring innovation into the world, make a country better. I think it's partially due to our religion, our belief system, our moral code. Another interesting aspect is that when Jews study Torah, and I think that even for Jews that don't study Torah, this has been this part of Judaism has been kept, is that you debate. So when you're a yeshiva bocher, you sit down and you study Talmud, and then you argue about it. And what does this mean? Why does it mean this? Well, what could it mean this? And you and I do that. And so constantly,
maybe too much.
There's no such thing as too much. But I think that again, for Jews who have never picked up a Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, a Talmud, etc., this memory, this common memory of study and debate has continued. And so it permeates all aspects of our lives. And so as Jews are in the world, whether they're actively thinking about being a Jew and making the world a better place, or simply living according to the moral code that has been passed down from generation to generation, it instructs or guides all of our actions, or many of our actions.
Interesting. So we spoke on our last episode a lot about the passion and enthusiasm for Judaism. And I think that, one thing that we share in common, as you mentioned, a lot of times is the debate and discussions and, what do you think? What do you think? Well, I disagree, and that's fine. And that's okay. And I think that the most important aspect of any debate is the yearning to learn, the eagerness to find a solution, to the reason why you're asking the question in the first place. When people argue, people tend to think that there's some sort of emotional discord between two people. If anything, the only people you could debate with are people you respect and you enjoy and you value as a person, because otherwise, what do you do with people today on social media who disagree with you? You just block them, and that's the end of the conversation.
Echo chambers.
Sorry, echo, yes, very much. And today we suffer from that in probably more than ever. I mean, unless you want to consider the old shtetl an echo chamber, which definitely wasn't. But today you could literally believe what you want to believe. And that this goes back to, this idea of belief in general is everything subjective. We could talk about this idea that what is true, what is epistemologically factual, and sometimes even things that everyone accepts as factual. Some big scientist or philosopher will come and negate it. I mean, till Einstein came around, people believed that the world always was. This idea of Aristotle, this idea of like eternity and in the status quo, and came along Einstein and really proved mathematically that that's not the case. And then all of a sudden, you have to rewrite textbooks and so on, which is the whole nature of science in general, is to learn through osmosis and learn through experience and so on. The other side of that is at some point, you accept, we've got to an end of an argument, and you'll have this in Talmud too. They're back and forth, and then it's like, it's time to daven mincha. It's time to take a break. Or we've reached the zenith of our knowledge. One of the most fascinating endings of a Talmud, which sounds like a bit of a cop out sometimes, but the Talmud will end teku. And teku literally means we will ask Elijah the prophet when he comes, when the Messiah comes, and it sounds a little bit like a surrender, but it's also the truest and most logically honest answer, which is we don't know. We've heard both sides. We've gotten to the extent of our experience, our knowledge, our thinking, our prowess, and well, I guess it just is what it is, and one day we'll find out.
So to kind of boil down to its essence, what you were saying, I think we're talking about the difference between trying to prove you're right versus seeking truth. And truth is hard to find. Proving you're right feels good in the moment, but does it move us forward as a people?
Right.
And so I love the idea of seeking truth. And I think that's what we often do, which is why we can agree or disagree, but still have fun and be friends. And because we have the same common goal, right? We're not working at odds. You're not seeking truth and I'm just trying to be right, and vice versa. And so doing that in the world at large, I think if more people sought truth and didn't just live in their echo chambers. And as you know, with social media and such now, it's easier than ever because the algorithm learns what your perspectives are and then just shares that information with you, and you don't get exposed to other things. There's this great quote, I believe, from Mark Twain, which is, if you don't read the newspapers, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspapers, you're misinformed. And so, it's hard to find truth, and there's always agenda. But if we spent more time seeking truth and not just trying to be right or reinforce what we already believe or know to be true, I think things would be better.
So it's interesting you talk about the word truth. In Hebrew, the word truth is emet.
Emet.
And
or emes. Das is the emes.
Emes, right?
That's Yiddish.
Yeah, depending on where in the world you're from. So what's interesting about the word truth is that in Hebrew, you can't appreciate this in English as much, but in the Hebrew emes, you have the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the middle, and the end. And one of the factors of truth, one of the characteristics of truth, is that it's consistent. The opposite of truth is generally associated with things like hypocrisy or dichotomy or contradiction. And contradictions can be reconciled, but there also has to be a consistency. When you want to build an argument, so you have the foundation, and then you're building a first floor, a second floor, a third floor, fourth floor, and you're entitled to build as high of a construct as you can. But if the foundation is faulty, eventually the upper level of the floors is going to collapse. And I think that what's interesting about truth is that when you build an argument, false premises are dangerous, because if you start off with the wrong foundation, then the entire argument, even if the argument is brilliant, could end up with a very fundamentally flawed, I think in code, we have a few programmers who, right? If your first programmer who you base your code on is bad code, you could have a problem years down the line, or many, many iterations down the line, many versions down the line that you don't even know exist until it's exposed later on.
We have a term for that. It's called garbage in, garbage out. And so actually, I've been having interesting debates with ChatGPT because...
Me too.
I know. And so it can certainly do things like write code, but it's trained on information that was created by humans, and some of that information is flawed. And so when it talks to you, it's based on information that at the ground floor, at the base level, may not be correct, assumptions that may not be correct. I actually had a fascinating conversation about black holes with ChatGPT, because I said...
Is this the latest version? Presumably, latest version.
This is 4, not 4 small o.
Got it.
So it was the last version. And I asked it, I said, are black holes established fact? And it said, yes. And I said, how do we know? And it gave some things. And I said, yes, but has a black hole ever been proven? And it said, yes, it has been proven, and explained why. And I kept questioning it, because the fact is, there are things that indicate that what they believe is an area in space that you can't see through and has all the characteristics of what they presume to be a black hole is a black hole. But of course, no one's gone up to a black hole and knocked on the door. And so while it's established that all the indications point to that it's true, it's
theoretical physics, is that what we categorize it as?
Yeah. And so there's many things in our lives which correlation and causation are not the same thing. And so to say that something is absolutely fact without being able to prove it, and when I say prove it, I didn't really realize that prove it was such a subjective thing, but in my debate with ChatGPT, I learned that proving it is somewhat subjective, depending on...
Completely subjective, I think. I had a funny discussion. It wasn't even a debate. It was very curtly telling ChatGPT was wrong. So I asked ChatGPT how many days are in the coming year, 5785. As we know, we're about to celebrate the new year, Rosh Hashanah, in a couple of weeks. And I said, looking for the data, I didn't have the answer, but I had a general idea. Mm-hmm. And I said, how many days in the year? And it said, well, this year is a leap year, so therefore there's 383 days in the year. And I said, no, it's not. It is not a leap year this coming year. Last year was a leap year. And it said in its curt and, respectful tone, my apologies, you're right. This year is not a leap year. And then start to tell me how many days would be in a non-leap year. What's going on? What is wrong with the aggregation of data? What's the problem?
Well, so ChatGPT at its core is a prediction engine. It's trying to predict the most likely output based on input. And it's not an accuracy engine. It's a prediction engine. And so there's, first of all, again, the information that it's trained on may or may not be correct. Second of all, it is predicting likelihood of output based letter by letter and word by word. And then there's something called temperature. And so they baked in this idea of temperature because they didn't want the AI to always give the same output based on input. If you said, tell me a funny story about bagels, or write an ode to gefilte fish, which I actually did have it write a fantastic ode to gefilte fish. I'll send it to you. They didn't want it to give the same answer every time. And so temperature is a number between 0 and 1. 0 represents the most accurate output. 1 represents the most creative output. And that number is constantly changing, and you don't know what it is.
Okay.
So it might be being more creative one time and more accurate another time.
So it's interesting because arguing with ChatGPT is very different than arguing logically. or Talmudically. Talmudically is probably more consistent with logic in the sense that there is a scope of knowledge and you're expected to know that scope of knowledge. Obviously, if you're arguing constitutional law, it's different scope of knowledge than if you're arguing, Jewish agricultural law, or court law, judicial law, and so on. And Judaism has many, many different spectrums within, the legal construct. But what's interesting is that I remember this in yeshiva, like you were expected to know so much about the topic. And then with all that knowledge, discuss and to orient yourself and to argue logically, why can't you use this case? Why can't you use that case? Why is this not like this? Why is that not like that? And you're forced, it almost seems more mathematical than creative. And am I getting that right?
Yeah. It's so the idea of artificial intelligence is not new, right? Machine learning has existed since the 60s. And there have been certainly steps forward, but I feel like the biggest step forward now is that it's the democratization of it, meaning that you have so many people able to interact with it because you don't have to be a programmer, you don't have to be a software developer. You just have a natural language model, large language model that you can speak to in common terms. And yes, computing power has gotten better. They've hit a critical mass of knowledge. All these things are true, but the types of conversations that you and I are having with it would not have been possible for the average person previously. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing humans are not perfect and algorithms are not perfect. Depends how you define perfect. But I mean in terms of always presenting true information or accurate information. And so with AI, it's as good as the information it was trained on, its ability to form connections. So just like we have neurons, the AI, you know what GPT stands for in ChatGPT?
Remind me.
The G is generative, it's generating something. The P is pre-training, which refers to the way it was trained. And the T is transformer, which is essentially the digital neuron. And so the connections between the digital neurons have to have been formed in order for it to give an output that is related to what you're talking about and then accurate.
So when we talk about different platforms, so ChatGPT versus others, is the pre-training the variable? What is the
pre-training is certainly part of it. There's also, they have a different number of CPUs, they have a different algorithm, they have different guardrails in place. It may have a different focus. So Claude is different than ChatGPT, which is different than Grok, which is different than other ones. And so I would say Copilot, which is Microsoft's flavor, and ChatGPT are probably the most similar because Microsoft invested a lot of money into OpenAI, which is a whole different story because OpenAI is a nonprofit that owns a capped for-profit company. There's a really interesting layers there. But Microsoft put in a whole bunch of money and got access to the technology. And so they're powered by really the exact same thing, although they're two different products. But the other ones go off in different directions. So
going back to Ode to Gefilte Fish.
Yes.
Where do you feel that, because obviously, as we mentioned, in terms of gathering knowledge, ChatGPT is not always as practical as something like Google, which, you find a reputable site. And I always recommend people, if you're looking for knowledge, go to certain sites that are known to care about the accuracy of their knowledge. Mm-hmm. How about where else would you say that ChatGPT could offer value in Jewish life? I was thinking about poetry, and as Jews, people often talk about different sectors, I don't know if you want to call it that, different areas of interest within Judaism. Obviously, we have mysticism, we have logic, we Talmud, we have the Midrashic, which is the more allegorical, narrative side. We have the scriptural, obviously, can't forget that. But then you have philosophical works, and people forget there's also a lot of poetry. So a lot of the machzor, right? Beautiful hymns that are written that are, there's no time for that usually, except for a day like Yom Kippur when you're doing nothing else. And there's literally there's going to be pages and pages of beautiful rhymes, which may make more sense in Hebrew than they do in any other language. And I feel like maybe ChatGPT would help in that regard. Where else would we see that, where can we use it, let's say, as Jews or in our daily lives? I'm always interested in the more Jewish side.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So anytime accuracy is not a concern, I think AI is a really fun tool to use. But one of the ways that I use it with Judaism is I like to read. And when I'm reading, whether it's Chumash or Talmud or Mishnah or whatever, or just history of Jews, and I come across something that I don't know, which is fairly often because there's more that I don't know than I do know. And then I can go to AI and I can say, tell me about this. So let's say you don't know who Moshe was. And you say, tell me about the biblical figure of Moshe from the Jewish perspective. It will give you an overview. And you can say it in a funny way. You can say, tell it to me as a Dr. Seuss story. And maybe that's more relatable to you. Or give me it as a Wikipedia page with references. You can, and by the way, asking AI for references is really interesting because either it will get it right and give you a real reference, which I find to be the most infrequent result. It will give you a reference that is broken and just doesn't actually click on it and goes nowhere. Mm-hmm. Or it gives you a reference which links to something that seems like it backs it up, but it actually doesn't. And so I think that's one of the areas that they really still need to work on is giving accurate references for source material. But everybody learns differently. And some people like reading very straightforward textbook style information. Some people like it to be much more narrated and fun. And so that's a great way to use AI is ask it Jewish questions, and maybe not like, you could have an ethical debate on different aspects of Judaism with AI, but I'm talking about more just asking it to explain things to you, which you might otherwise either just gloss over or not have the time to research, and ask it in a way that you will relate to.
Okay. So it's interesting because in a certain sense, what you're describing sounds a little bit like Midrash. So Midrash usually gets the bad press of being narrative. And I say bad press because we think of narrative as untrue. We think of narrative as inaccurate sometimes, like ChatGPT. And in a certain sense, narrative has a function much more like hyperbole, has a function much deeper than just true or untrue. It's perspective. Now, your perspective on, let's say, Moses, right, will affect how you think of Moses. So similar to your perspective on God, if God is the angry guy up in the sky with the big, long, white beard and he strikes lightning on anybody who disagrees with him, you're going to have a very naturally negative view of God. Whereas if God is the nice parent who's always giving you presents and sometimes reprimands you like your parents usually do, then all of a sudden God becomes reasonable. And you could talk to God. God's not unreasonable. So this narrative business is very, very, it's not only, number one, it's critical because you can't read through, when we used to do book reports back as kids, like they used to ask you, tell me about this character. And you're like, well, I never got a character introduction in the book. And like, yeah, that's your job. Based on your reading of the book once or twice, what do you think about this character? And you have two people who have a completely different view of the protagonist or the antagonist. Sometimes reversing those roles even, and there's ways that movies, of course, they make us identify with certain characters, positive or negative. Social media does that too. Mainstream media does that too. Very, very manipulating in that way. But then there's just, what do you think based on your context? And sometimes you have no context. And I think this is where storytelling comes in very, very much in necessity. So, when we ask our grandparents, what was it like back in the shtetl, 30, 40, 50, years, whatever, before the common era, before this generation, what was it like before cell phones and what was it like before, and you listen to it's not even history, it's a perspective, and their perspective might be different than somebody else in the shtetl, but you're hearing a personal a personal recollection, a personal perspective. And I think that one of the things we focus on in this podcast is perspective. And I think that perspective is important because narrative is like connecting dots. And sometimes you could make a different picture, right? Which means something very different. I mean, this is psychologists do this all the time, the Rorschach tests and so on. What do you see? And based on what you see, what you project is really what your reality is in a certain sense. If you're a negative person by nature, or you were perceived, your background is negative, you had a lot of trauma in your life, you might see the world as negative. People are out to get me. If you have a much more positive, healthy perspective on life, then you might see the world as very giving and very abundant and very generous. So the Midrashic, it, to me, is not only, hey, this is, one perspective on this. It's like, what does the Torah say about who Abraham was as a person? Because the Torah literally starts from 75. He was born and then 75 years old. And then God speaks to him, which itself is like, what you're missing. Who is he? Where does he come from? Who's his mother? Where was he raised? All these questions, which I'm sure I'd love to ask ChatGPT to find out what they think, because they obviously didn't read the Midrash.
Well, but so that's a perfect example where you can say, okay, so here's the setup. It doesn't talk about him until he's 75, really. And in future Jewish texts, so anything written afterwards, is there an explanation of why? And what are those explanations? And
of why it's lacking?
Yeah, of why it's lacking. And so it'll give you if there is,
sure.
It'll give you a summary. Right. And so then you can dig into each one. So as opposed to after spending, years of your life studying, which I'm not saying don't study, you should, but to initially spark that interest, you can basically use the power of artificial intelligence to sift through tens of thousands of pages of information and zero in on what interests you, and then allow you to go deeper. That's, if I had to sum up the way I use AI, it's find what I'm interested in and then help me understand what questions I should be asking in order to dig deeper on my own by going and picking up a Chumash or another book.
So maybe segueing away from AI perspective and then going back to the academic side.
Yeah.
What I find often so interesting about the academic side, the academia, which again, I'm going to a certain aspect of academia, which is, the Jewish perspective of Judaism, or the Torah's perspective of Torah, as it was presented for thousands of years. And you could study, all the books. You can go through all the, many people haven't gone through those books. And that's a shame, because there's a wealth of knowledge out there that, we had a guy here, we used to talk often, and he was always fascinated by the fact that the stories that the Midrash shares are stories that are so fantastic you cannot make them up. And I'll explain why I think that's so. When Hollywood tries to make a film about Noah or Abraham, what they end up realizing is that you're lacking context. So what do? They make it up, right? Which you would expect people to do. And there's this fascinating quote from Tom Clancy I always enjoyed, which is that the difference between fiction and reality is that you can't make up reality. It's sometimes so bizarre and so it's true because nobody would ever think of this. And I remember going through the Midrash on the story of Joseph, the backstory, which is probably rated R. It would never be made into a movie. And I remember we had a college student there with us, and he was like, he was floored by what the Jewish perspective on what was going on. And I think the same thing with Abraham. Like, who was he as a person? And there's this interesting narrative about Abraham that he was, the story goes, whether it's accurate or true, I don't think it matters so much as the character development of Abraham. And the idea is that he was once in his father's idol shop. His father had an idol shop. He was retailing these different idols, the idol of
It's okay. I collect the G.I. Joes.
God,
we've all done
the god of this, the god of that, God of fertility, god of love. And one day he leaves Abraham in charge of the store, and he comes back a couple hours later, and there's it's chaos. And basically every idol is smashed to smithereens. And except for Nimrod, which is a 6'5" idol standing with a big hammer. And Terach, Abraham's father, says to Avram, what happened? And in a prepared scripted speech, Abraham says, well, this idol and that idol got into a brawl and they all started fighting. And, it was basically, dog eat dog until Nimrod was the last man standing. And basically he won the fight. And this father turns to Abraham and says, you think I'm an idiot? Like, these idols don't argue. They don't think, they don't see, they're not jealous of each other. And he turns to his father and says, then why do you worship them? And there's much discussion of if this is hyperbole, if this actually happened, was it a conversation? But one thing is for certain is that with that narrative, with that perspective of Abraham, when you start to see what he does the rest of his life, it makes sense that his character is an idol smasher, which isn't so surprising that his descendants, right, from some of his families are idol smashers till today. That's their, people like smashing, the gods of other religions and demoralizing and demeaning other people who don't agree with them. And not that Abraham necessarily had that. Abraham was seeking truth in a certain perspective, but unbridled passion for God and for truth, which could be taken the right way, taken the wrong way. And, in a certain way, regardless of how it's manifest, that is Abraham. It's either this is what I'm going to teach the world. I'm going to teach the world my way. And maybe that's why he's the father of 3 or 6 religions, depending on how you count.
Yeah, this is not directly related, but it just, what you said sparked something in me. One of the things that I love about being Jewish is common memory. And what I mean by that is I can meet a Jew anywhere in the world and have a connection to them because of our thousands of years of history.
Is that epigenetic? Or is that just culture?
I don't know. I mean, part of it is culture. So for example, if I meet somebody that I've never spoken to before and I say the word schmutz, it reminds me of my grandmother saying, "You've got some schmutz on your face," and licking her thumb and rubbing it on my face. And pretty much any Jew I meet will laugh. And the reaction that you just had is the exact reaction that I have from every person.
The saying about Yiddish is that you never have to translate any word because it just sounds like what it is. You say schmutz on your face. Well, what else could that be?
Right, exactly. So part of it is certainly cultural. But is there something deeper? Is there some deeper bond? And I that's something I'd love to explore. I don't even know how to begin exploring it, but I definitely feel a connection. And I know as human beings, we feel the need to identify with a group, and the group is, it's evolutionarily beneficial and all of that.
Not Jews. Jews like to stand out.
But there's definitely a connection, and a deep connection that I feel to Jews. I was hiking through the woods of Costa Rica and ran into a Jewish guy there, and there was nobody around. We hadn't seen anybody all day, but immediately we bonded. And I'm sure I would have bonded with somebody else, but at a level that this is a complete stranger. We've never spoken. We have nothing in common, yet we have everything in common.
So back to this idea of the Jewish people. Do you believe in the Jewish people? One thing I've found. One discussion I find fascinating is whether Judaism is a race or a religion or a culture or a family. And what you end up realizing is every one of those, let's call it, little journeys, paths, ends up with a dead end. Because if it's a race, we have different races, Jewish.
You can't convert to a race, right?
Right. And we have every race you can imagine Jewish, right?
Right.
You have black Jews, you have Hispanic Jews, you have Asian Jews, you have...
As my great uncle said, you have orange Jews.
Yes, you
apple
do.
Jews.
Yes. And then you have nationalistic differences. So you had Russian Jews and Polish Jews, and they were fighting each other on two sides of,
Or Moroccan Jews and Russian Jews.
Yes. I don't know if they were fighting per se.
No, but they... So in Israel, when there were Moroccan politicians, the Russians had an issue with them and vice versa.
Right. So then there's the nationalistic differences, but I'm focusing on the fact that there's even a nationalistic divide, American Jews versus Canadian Jews, the other version. Is it really that different? And then, I'm often asked the question, are you an American Jew or a Jewish American? In English, the noun is always second. So some reason the second word you use is more important than the first. So if you're a Jewish American, then you're American first, and then you're Jewish is your adjective. You're describing the type of Jew you are. If you're an American Jew, then you are a Jew, and the type of Jew you are is you're an American Jew. And I've always answered that I'm an American Jew. And the follow-up is why. And my answer is that, let's say I was, living in somewhere in the north part of the country, and for some reason there's some sort of war between Canada, some hypothetical war between Canada and America, and the border changes, which it often does during war. And now I'm on the other side of the border, and I'm suddenly a Canadian Jew, not by choice, but by mere fact that I ended up on the opposite side of the border. Does that change my identity? So the Jewish identity, and then the question is, what is Jewish identity? And I remember someone came to Orlando, and she found out she was Jewish on her trip. She came from Germany, of all places. And during her trip, she found out she was Jewish. She found out her mom's Jewish and her mom's Jewish. And then she's trying to identify herself. So what does that mean? And then she's asking everybody, and nobody knows the answer. And they call me over and they say, what is Judaism? What's the defining factor? And I said, oh, that's easy. It's a soul thing. And it really is a soul thing. So is it epigenetic? Probably. Is it cultural? Also. Is it nationalistic? Could be. Depends, how Zionist you are or not. Is it a language? All these factors are factors, but they're not the thing itself. And so what is the thing itself? I think it's a soul thing. We have a soul connection. I remember we had somebody who, people forget how few Jews there are in the world.
Or they never knew in the first place.
Right. They imagine there's money, 1 billion or something.
Right.
And I remember
of the world's population. That's often what I get is I'll ask people, what percentage of the world do you think are Jews? And they'll say, 10%.
Right. Maybe in Miami or New York City
right.
and Lower East Side. It's just fascinating how many people are just unaware, and they'll be dating a Jewish girl. Them being non-Jewish, and then the girl will have, this happened to me, and a bunch of Jews come over, and all of a sudden she's connecting with them in this sort of more than friends, family. We are family, and her boyfriend is confused, I never met these people in my life. I didn't even know their names till 5 minutes ago, and you're talking to them like you have 1,000 years of history, and she's like, we do. And I think it's such a fascinating phenomenon that wherever we are in the world, and I've met Jews backpacking in New Zealand, and I've met Jews in the mountains of India, and there's an immediate connection. And the language, both of us speak a basic Hebrew, at least enough to get by in a conversation. And, you could say shalom. And my father had this experience on a plane where he's sitting probably in the front row, and he was actually sitting next to a pastor. And, they small talk back and forth. And this Jew walks on the plane and sees my father, and he waves. And, okay, nothing of it. A couple of people, this is probably JetBlue, JFK to Orlando, so I wouldn't be surprised. And the next guy comes on, Jewish yarmulke, whatever, sees my dad, nods his head. So the pastor turns to my dad and says, do you know that guy? My dad says, no idea. Okay. Another couple comes on, a family, 4 kids, they're going to Disney World, right? Sees my dad, shalom. And at this point, the pastor turns to my dad, he's like, why are they saying hello to you? And my father says, I don't know, because they're Jewish. And he says, there's probably been 18 Catholics who walked on this plane, and they didn't look at me edgewise. And my father thought that was just a very meaningful experience, in that we have a connection to each other. Sometimes Jews don't say hi to each other, maybe in New York City, but then suddenly the same 2 Jews will be stuck in an airport in Honolulu, and they'll start talking really fast.
Yes. Well, okay. So that brings up a really good question. I'm actually going to now even question what I'm saying here. But when I walk down the street, someone doesn't necessarily know that I'm Jewish. Now, when I tell people I'm Jewish,
I can't say the same.
99% of the time they say, I knew you were Jewish. So I guess they figured it out. But for you, you are obviously identifiable as a Jew. And so it's remarkable to me that I meet as many Jews as I do, and we figure it out, because neither of us are wearing it, on our foreheads, but yet we figured it out. And it happens to me all the time. But you are obviously a magnet, right? So you people see you and they know, and so they will nod or connect with you or intentionally come talk to you or acknowledge your existence. And
my favorite was I was in a Starbucks once and someone came over to me and asked me if I was Jewish. And I said, how'd you guess? So yeah, it happens. My perspective on this is that in addition to being a proud Jew, I believe that when a Jew sees a proud Jew, they become proud to be Jewish. And I know this story that it goes around the Chabad community often, and it's told over, as you'll see, as a sort of encouraging story, but it's actually empowering as well. And the story goes that there were these two young student rabbis who were sent to some godforsaken city in Texas, mind you, probably in the 70s, where there was not much Judaism going on, definitely not in this city. And they were supposed to scout out the city. This was how a lot of Chabads actually started way back in the day, is that they would go to certain cities that didn't really have an established community, try to knock on doors, check the phone pages, those days, Cohen, Goldberg, Greenberg, see, make some phone calls, get some doors slammed in your face, get some, phones hung up on you, and basically send a scout report back to Brooklyn. And they would gauge based on the interest and based on different factors, whether there was something to talk about having a Jewish community be established in that place. So these two young students go through this entire city, make phone calls, knock on doors, zero results, like zero. And they felt like we wasted our time. So they go back to Brooklyn and they had a private audience with the Rebbe. And they were upset in a certain sense. They felt useless. They felt that they were failures. And the Rebbe basically said to them that when a Jew walks with a proud demeanor, with a proud posture, with a kippah, with tzitzis, in an open way, out of the closet Jew, as they call it, it creates an environment, it creates an influence in the city. And they interpreted that answer as sort of an apologetic, like the rabbi's trying to make us feel good, even though we accomplished nothing. And that was a story. Many, many years later, these two young students are now married, they have children, and they're living in Brooklyn, so there's a Farbrengen, which is a Yiddish word for a gathering, and everyone's talking and, sharing meaningful stories. And, someone, I guess, had a very similar experience to this student who's now, older man. And he says, listen, I'm going to tell you what the Rebbe told me. You take it as you want. And he tells over the story, tells him that the Rebbe said every person has an influence regardless of where they are. So this young man stands up on the other side of the table and says, could you tell me what city you were in? So they tell him, and Laredo, Texas, something like that. And then they say, what year was it? And they tell him. And he says, I have the rest of that story. So he says the story was that my mom, who was a Russian, from the old country, and she had immigrated to America, and we really had nothing to do Judaism in our house whatsoever. And she's in her apartment washing her dishes, and she looks out the window and sees a mirage of these two Hasidim walking down the street, and she has a double take, like what is this? Like, what did I go through a time loop or something? And she turns to her son and says, I think you should learn more about your Judaism. And she ended up putting her kid in a Jewish school, and from there he went to a yeshiva, and he eventually became an out of the closet Jew as well and embraced his Judaism. And now he's sitting at the table and said, you guys changed my life. You didn't realize it. You would never have imagined that you had any sort of influence. You said yourself, you didn't think you had an influence, but you did. And that's the experience I have walking through the city every single day, walking down the street, walking in a gas station. I once had an experience. I was wearing a baseball cap, and just the tzitzis were only identifying factors. And I didn't think, I thought, tzitzis, a lot of people don't really know what those are. The tzitzis are the tassels we wear outside, which is really like a big toga that we wear under our shirts. And a lot of people don't really identify it with Judaism so much. At least I didn't think so. And I walk into this gas station, and from across the hall, across the room, I hear, that's the coolest looking rabbi I've ever seen. and it was just a reminder to me that I had a very similar experience in Vietnam, where I was sitting in a bar in Vietnam, and from across the room, I hear in, slang Hebrew, halan, which is, what's up? And I turn around and I see these two Israelis. And the first question they asked me was, Ata Chabad? You know, like, what are you doing here? Not surprised to see a Chabadnik sitting somewhere in the mountains of Vietnam. And it was a reminder that wherever you are, like, you could think you're off the beaten path. You could think that nobody knows who you are. You could think that you're camouflaged, but we're not. And even when we meet each other, sometimes you're like, is something Jewish by any chance? And they're like, how do you know? And like, I'm Jewish. Oh, you're Jewish. And I don't know. I once read that there actually is the ability to detect a Jew from his sort of spiritual aura, and most of us can't do it properly. But there's a Jewish way to do stuff.
There is. I wonder for you if you feel a constant sense of responsibility, because I feel a sense of responsibility to represent the Jewish people in the world. But again, I am not always recognizable as a Jew. And so I can, if I see an opportunity, I try to take it to represent Jews well in the world. But it's not like every moment of every day I have that responsibility. And for you, being constantly recognizable as a Jew, do you feel a constant, maybe weight is the wrong word because that has a negative connotation, but to always be on, just like you trying to always be a comedian and be funny is difficult, trying to always be the best version of yourself.
I don't know if I consciously think that every day, but I definitely do feel that role. I feel that responsibility as, I think every Jew should feel that to a certain extent. I also understand that people are sometimes intimidated, and the I don't know if it's the beard, I don't know if it's the glasses, I'm not sure what it is, but sometimes people notice and they want to ask, but they're afraid to ask. I'm talking Jews or non-Jews, and people will come over to me and say, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And I'll be like, "Sure, shoot." And then they'll say, "Could I ask you about your kippah?" And I'll say, "Sure." And they'll say, well, what is it? What does it represent? Where does it come from? What's the background? And I'll tell them, and I always try to end the conversation with, thanks for asking. Because I appreciate when people try to learn. Mm-hmm. There was a cute TikTok going around a couple of weeks ago of this woman who, obviously not Jewish, and just trying to figure out the kippah. Like, could some Jews weigh in? Like, what is this? How does it stay on the head? What's it made of? Is it magical? Like, what happens with it? And I think it's really, the world has to learn. And for so long we were in the ghetto. For so long we were bottled up and closed up and shut down and silenced. And instead of criticizing the Jew, instead of demeaning the Jew, I think that we're in an age of wisdom. After an age of, the internet already exists. The internet will tell you right, wrong, and everything in between. I think the question of wisdom is finding your truth and finding what makes sense to you, and that happens through conversation. And go to a Jew and say, what is it about? Why do you do this? Or what do you think about this? And the conversation that, and then when they learn something they didn't know before, they're fascinated. It's like, why did we not know this? Because we've seen the Jew in the world of physics. We've seen the Jew in the world of biology. We've seen the Jew in the world of philosophy or in comedy. We don't know the Jew in Judaism because that's always been more secluded and more private. And I think one of the purposes of these conversations is to sort of open up the door a little bit and to invite people in and sort of have conversations as deep and as diverse as the conversations may be about these behind the closed doors of what usually happens, because so much of what happens in Judaism is behind closed doors, and we're just taking care of ourselves, and we're sort of traumatized by, just leave us alone. Am Yisrael Chai means leave us the heck alone, and let us do our thing in peace for the first time in history. And I think that the Rebbe reminded us that that's not enough. We have to also be extroverted Jews. We have to also go out and sometimes invite questions and say, does anyone have any questions? Or people are probably wondering what this is or what this is or what this is. Or, I remember putting on tefillin in Peru. And just seeing people look at me, and I said, "You're probably wondering what this is." And they were like, "God, yes, we didn't know if we could ask." I said, "Sure, you could ask." And I think the saddest thing is when we brush people off and it's not important, it's not for you. And I think that's where conspiracies come from, is when everyone shuts down. The rabbi who has a theory about, how did antisemitism start? And the theory is that, it says in the Bible that we're chosen. So you go to the first Jew and you say, okay, I'm interested, chosen for what? And they say, oh, we're not chosen. And they say, okay, that's weird. And then they go to another Jew and they say, what does chosen mean? And they say, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. And it's strange. You go from person to person, and then he goes to a conference in the big city, and he meets his friend, and he tells him about his experiences. He says, "That's weird. I had the same experience." They must be hiding something. There must be some sort of inner secrets that are being held from us. And I think that a much more practical approach is that the Jew is finally comfortable being comfortable. And I think that for the non-Jews, they have to really embrace the Jew and say, what do you think about this topic? And for the Jew, we have to be comfortable not being too comfortable and not being in our own corner.
I think a lot of Jews, especially from the secular world, but Jews in general, are uncomfortable with the term chosen because it feels like they're saying either they're better, or it feels like they have this responsibility that everybody else doesn't have. And so many Jews that I talk to are uncomfortable with the idea of being chosen. Well, you mentioned our non-Jewish friends, and specifically Christians who don't believe in replacement theology, replacement theology is the idea that the Christians replace the Jews as the chosen people. But there's many Christians out there who don't believe that. They believe that the Jews still are the chosen people, and the Christians are a grafted on branch. And so the Christians that don't believe in replacement theology will often say to me, "It's so wonderful. It's amazing. You're the chosen people." And so they're often much more excited about us being the chosen people than we are. And so I think it's good to embrace it in the right way. It would be nice if we were as excited about it as they are. Right.
And also, I think it was Spider-Man who said, "With great power comes great responsibility."
I think it was his uncle that said
it. It was his uncle, right? It was his rabbi. And I think that would be the simplest definition of being chosen. So if you want to go back to narrative, what is the Torah's narrative of that? And one perspective I've heard is that God really wants society to be good. God wants society to be wholesome and get along regardless of differences, tribal differences, cultural differences, nationalistic differences, idealistic differences. But the world didn't want to. And the world was sort of stuck in this ancient caveman mentality of, my God's greater than your God, and, my cave's greater than your cave. And God really needed a messenger to come to the world. Or God needed a message to get to the world. And the message was, be good. So the story goes that God went to every nation on earth and said, and we're talking about not modern nations, we're talking about 4,000 years ago nations, and said, how about we make a society which is, everybody's equal, and we teach we educate, and we study, and we learn, and we don't, fight each other in coliseums, and we don't kill babies or old people. And society had a problem with that. And God had a problem with that and came to the Jew and said, we have a problem. Nobody wants to be good. So could you be the messenger to bring goodness to the world, to bring a message of morality and a message of decency to a society which is not really interested? And the Jewish people said, oh, this will be easy, right? Like they'll love us for it. And God said, so to speak, good luck with that. And I think that if you fast forward 4,000 years, there's a talk on YouTube from a rabbi in Israel, and he says that almost every Judeo-Christian value, almost every American value, every international value, global value that we have could be narrowed down to a value that comes from the Torah. Not as the Jewish book, but as God's book. God's not speaking only to the Jews. God is speaking in the Bible and the Torah to mankind. And that's why in the Torah you have rules like don't murder and don't steal and don't do these terrible things and don't harm animals, and to accept a objective authority. Because if you don't have objective authority, like everyone gets to decide, what is good and who is good and so on. We knew examples quite recently of cultures and societies which, people are good, but these are not people. They're subhuman. And that was their excuse for exterminating, and killing people they didn't agree with. So the Jewish perspective is that we have a responsibility to the world. I think that ideas like No Child Left Behind, And you go to Shema, Vishinantam, Levanecha, V'dibarta bam, speak to your children, teach them how to read, teach them how to, integrate into society, teach them how to swim, teach them how to have a job. I mean, this is fundamental life. How do you have a society where, you don't have that education or that family unit or that responsibility from person to their neighbor? And I think that's what it means to be chosen. It's a big responsibility. And I think that, for some reason it's controversial today to say we'll get credit for it, but we're not doing it for the credit. If the world is just a better place today than it was yesterday, we're happy.
Well said. I think in today's world, we're uncomfortable with responsibility, and we're uncomfortable with sharing something that is good and we're proud of. And I think it's fine. It's great to be proud of something. The fact that if we can make the world better for Jews and non-Jews alike, then that's wonderful. And I think that the idea of chosen has evolved over time, the meaning of the word. But in its truest sense, it means what we're talking about here. It means we're chosen to make the Jewish and non-Jewish world better.
I think that is the purpose of the world in general, is to make this world better and to make us better. So I think it's one of the deep secrets of Judaism. And if we could only do that, the proverbial, turning the jungle into a garden, the jungle and the garden is the same place.
You should see my garden. It's pretty much a jungle.
Well, we could do some work on the garden as we could on this world. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having
pleasure.
me.
Definitely. We'll see you again.
I look forward to it.
Till next time.
And your beard is more impressive than my beard.
You're a beard in progress.
I actually trimmed it today because I was thinking, I have to look presentable for this, but I actually should have gone the other direction.
Yes. People say, how do you have such a nice beard? How do you get such a big beard? I say, stop shaving is number one. So.